itinerary than the previous years. We started in Alabama. We went to Selma, and we drove through Jackson and stopped at Medgar Evers' house, which you'll hear about, and then drove to Selma. We visited Brown Chapel AME Church, the Live Oak Cemetery, the National Voting Rights Museum, and we walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which is indeed holy ground. We spent 2 nights then in Montgomery, Alabama, visiting the Legacy Museum, from enslavement to mass incarceration, and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. And those are 2 held together by the Equal Justice Initiative, founded by Brian Stevenson, author of Just Mercy. And they're actually working on a new piece of that I can't remember the timeline of when that will open, but they continue to add and build, and that is definitely worth a visit if you have not been there. From Montgomery, we drove to Birmingham, visiting the Civil Rights Institute, spending time in Kelly Ingram Park, and touring the 16th Street Baptist Church. And then from Birmingham, we headed west to the area of Mississippi where Emmett Till had gone from Chicago down to visit family, and where he ended up being abducted, tortured, and murdered. We ended the pilgrimage down back in Jackson, where we toured the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. The stories are too many for one setting, and it was a challenge to get down to where they each had just a couple of minutes. So I know you will just hear a taste of the trip, a peek into the pilgrimage and the ways we've been changed. And if you'd like to hear fuller versions, I know there are folks here, myself included, that would love to share more. Coming to a Sunday school class, having coffee, a small group, just let me know. So now let's begin.
Good morning. I'm Robbie Cripe, and I'd like to share a few reasons why I would recommend the Civil Rights Pilgrimage. It's an opportunity to spend a focused amount of time visiting museums, memorials, intrepid centers, parks, cemeteries, and many good restaurants to give you a comprehensive history of the Civil Rights Movement and the lived history of Black Americans from the earliest origins of enslavement. The visited sites have been chosen based on their quality, their location, and their historical significance. The Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama is a jewel of a museum. It is thoughtfully planned to provide an overall experience that grips you from the moment you begin your journey. One such moment for me was the warehouse exhibit, where there were holograms of enslaved individuals waiting for their time at the auction and before while they were in a slave jail. A male child's voice called out, "Mama," and it was like a gut punch when I thought about the unthinkable family separations due to slavery. Data provided by the museum showed that almost half of enslaved people experienced separation either from a spouse or parent. It is a lot to take in, but thankfully there are appropriate places throughout the museum for quiet reflection and to regroup if needed before continuing. Another impactful experience was the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, otherwise known as the Lynching Memorial. It is physically imposing by design, with hanging granite tablets etched with names and dates of lynching victims, not just by state, but also by counties within the state. While walking through, I was stopped in my tracks by a tablet that had the name of the county where I grew up here in Texas. It listed 4 names and dates. I cannot claim it was totally surprising, but it was certainly sobering. Another impactful part of this memorial was the signage at one part listing reasons for some of the lynchings, with many of them involving some type of frivolous offense reported by a white woman. The whole pilgrimage is a powerful experience on many levels. I find myself still processing parts of it months later. If you have the availability to go, I would highly recommend it.
Well, if you're already crying before you get up here, that is not a good sign. I haven't practiced the speech without crying. We'll see how it goes. My name is Candace Hicks. I was so blessed and definitely transformed on this wonderful journey. First, my heartfelt thanks to you, First Methodist of Austin, for allowing a foreigner from West Texas to travel along. If I had to put into a phrase best defining my experience or epiphany, it would be a love that forgives. From the moment at the bottom of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, when so graciously welcomed by a tour guide who taught me that anger only hurts its host. And he also told us, if you can hate someone, they have defeated you already. Not quotes of his, as he said, but that was the beginning of this gracious outreach to us. It continued to the gracious reception at the 16th Street Church in Birmingham, Alabama, where a love that forgives continues to resonate and bring strength and renewal. And it's not coincidentally, I think, the title of the Sunday school lesson being shared on that tragic day in 1963. And then even to the personnel in restaurants, museums, hotels, and convenience stores, such kindness was shown to us along the way. We were not denied seating in any restaurant. I often have heard that forgiveness is the only ticket out of here, and I have seen and walked it through this pilgrimage. I was so touched with the reconciliation and resolve that seems to permeate and great hope in this geographic area. Being a retired educator, I felt very well steeped in history, but I felt differently as we went along, visited museums, saw sites literally in person and not from textbooks or the Walter Cronkite broadcast in the evening of my childhood. I had only been given one version of the history of the civil rights movement, slavery, and other issues concerning injustice. I had also strangely not thought about the inequality in the educational systems. Pics of affluent classrooms of children in the 50s versus a black classroom struck me so deeply, again as a retired educator. Cruelty and hate had saturated every aspect of society, but there is hope that the tide is continuing to change. There could never be enough amends. There is still so much work to do, but I returned with an open heart and renewed resolve, with a new lens and a desire to make a difference in some way going forward. Beth?
Good morning. I'm Beth Ryder, and last October I had the privilege of traveling, contemplating, sharing experiences and meals with a very fine group. My journey with the Civil Rights Pilgrimage actually began a few months before the trip as I began and ultimately completed reading the book Just Mercy. Multiple times I had to pause in my reading as vivid descriptions of the sheer brutality, discrimination, hatred, and death sentences exhibited toward those individuals of color were hard to read about, much less come to terms with. This trip brought to light my meager knowledge of a great many harsh truths and injustices. I am no stranger to advocacy, as I have an adult son with cerebral palsy, and so I understand the need to extend outside of a comfort zone, difficult as it is. One example of going outside my comfort zone was when we visited the very memorable Legacy Museum, and I was immediately blasted with videos, photos, and descriptions of children torn from their parents, of abuse, belittling, and beatings to many individuals of all ages while waiting to be sold into slavery. Can you imagine? Another was when John and I walked up the dried brush and crumbling debris to the Black Bayou Bridge, a site where multitudes of lynched people had their bodies thrown overboard into the murky river below, including Emmett Till, and where most were probably not recovered. It's one thing to look at a photo, but quite another to actually stand at a site where evil was committed. The bridge is not used now, and the river is dried up in that spot, but that doesn't erase the history of what transpired there. We traveled to historic sites and museums in Selma, Montgomery, and Birmingham, Alabama, and to Greenwood, Money, Glendora, and Jackson, Mississippi. During these 6 days, I tried to observe, read, and process as much of the massive information presented as possible in the moments that they were presented. What I discovered, though, was by Saturday evening, I was on emotional overload. I had to take Saturday evening off by myself to head to my room, where I wept as if my heart would, in a way that my heart would not fully recover from. Looking back, I wonder if those advocates and pioneers that I observed via photos and in writing experienced a similar now what moment, and that instead of only despairing over the horrific facts and acts committed, maybe the seeds of a plan and call to action were being planted. Perhaps this also applies to me in some way. There are generations of people who have lived and continue to live with the injustices of racial discrimination. There are also people who have worked and continue to work to change bigotry, unfair attitudes, to teach, to move forward into acts of bravery and even danger to chip away at the injustices. This last photo I'm sharing is from the stone inscription, Invocation, which was located at the end of the National Memorial of Peace and Justice tour. By the way, the weather was rainy, cold, and somber, which really seemed to fit. I'd like to read this invocation. The wind brings your names. We will never discover your names, nor your shadows beneath each branch and tree. The truth comes in on the wind, is carried by water. There is such a thing as truth. Tell us how you got over. Say, soul, look back in wonder. Your names were never lost, each name a holy word. The rocks cry out, call out each name to sanctify this place. Sounds in human voices, silver or soil, a moon, a sorrow song, a keen, a cackle, a harmony, a hymnal, handbook, chart, a sacred text, a stomp, an exhortation. Ancestors, you will still find us in cages, despised and disciplined. You will find us still misnamed. Here you will find us despite. You will not find us extinct. You will find us here memoried and storied. You will find us here mighty. You will find us here divine. You will find us where you left us, but not as you left us. Here you endure and are luminous. You are not lost to us. The wind carries sorrow, sighs, and shouts. The wind brings everything. Nothing is lost. By Elizabeth Alexander.
Ed Berger, and I joined this church the first time in 1965 as a kid. My family and I came back and rejoined in 1990, several years later after we lived in many other places. I considered going on the 2022 pilgrimage when Jan signed up, but I wasn't emotionally ready for what I suspected would be an intense experience. I made the right decision to wait until last October. That said, I still wasn't prepared for what I encountered. I grew up in the 50s and 60s in a small town west of San Antonio with a population of 45% Anglo, 40% Hispanic, and 5% Black. I'm sure there was discrimination, but I was mostly clueless and I just didn't see it. Racism and unrest and rampant discrimination was in other places that I heard about from newspapers and in TV news. Our schools in the little town were fully integrated from the day I entered first grade. When my family relocated to Austin in 1965, my class of 66 at Austin High was very diverse, as was UT. Throughout my professional career and adulthood, I've interacted with people of all races, ethnicities, and backgrounds, and tried to live by the golden rule. But I have not been particularly sensitive to the injustices many of my acquaintances and friends endured. After this pilgrimage, I began to understand. Whether in cemeteries and museums or at the sites of assassinations, murders, bombings, beatings, or even nonviolent, peaceful demonstrations, one can't help but feel the presence of thousands of souls who were both victims of and leaders in the civil rights movement for justice. There's an old saying that to truly know a person, you must walk in their shoes. In this case, I disagree. We couldn't possibly know what that was like. But we pilgrims walked in their footsteps where so much of it happened. There were many memorable places, as some folks have already described, but I'm going to focus on our first and last stops on the journey. En route to Selma, we detoured into Jackson, Mississippi, to the home of Medgar Evers, who was assassinated on his driveway in June 1963. The home is now part of the National Park Service and was not open to the public when we were there. But we stood on his driveway where he stood and where he died. Our last visit before heading home was also in Jackson, the Interconnected Museum of Mississippi History and the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, part of the state's Department of Archives and History. The Civil Rights Museum gallery exhibits pulled no punches, beginning with the earliest days of Africans and slavery in the state to Jim Crow, to those who gave their lives in the movement. In a day and age when some candidates for public office ignore and sometimes rewrite history, it was refreshing to see a state that was part of the Confederacy sponsor a museum that was so forthcoming. And I learned from a docent at the museum that a foundation associated with them provides free admission to every Mississippi school child, and that even extends to transportation and sometimes a place to stay if they can't do it in one day. Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. That gave me hope for the future. Clearly, there's a lot of work to be done in the realm of social justice at our own border, throughout the world. But the pilgrimage journey we took continues to give me hope, and I believe it could do the same for you.
My name is Karen Janes, and I joined this church in 2018. I want to tell you a little bit more about walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. As we walked across the bridge, I kept thinking about the people who marched across that very bridge, demanding the right to vote on Bloody Sunday, March 7th, 1965. On the other end of the bridge were cops with dogs and clubs and guns and horses. And the marchers were armed with nothing but their faith and their determination to secure their constitutional right to vote. Blacks had been trying to register for some time, but had been frustrated by officials using Alabama's racist voting laws to deny registration. So it was decided to march 50 miles from Selma to the state capital of Montgomery to call attention to their plight and demand the right to vote. The march started at a prominent African Methodist church in Selma, I don't know, maybe 3/4 of a mile from the bridge, and went over the bridge toward Montgomery. When the marchers reached the end of the bridge, they were told to go back. John Lewis, one of the leaders of the march, asked if officials would talk with the marchers. Without any further communication, the troops attacked. With all of those things, They didn't actually shoot, but they used their guns as clubs. They used clubs. They rode their horses into people. They sicked dogs on people. Many of the marchers were seriously injured. John Lewis, one of the leaders of the march that day, was to the civil rights movement what James Madison was to the formation of constitutional government. Not the most important guy, but one of the key people who made it happen. Lewis was whacked on the head with a billy club so hard that his skull was seriously cracked. As he lay on the bridge in his own vomit and his own blood, he thought he was dying. He didn't want to die, but he wrote later that he was at peace, thinking, I have done what God wanted me to do. He didn't die, of course. He lived for almost another half a century, continuing to work for liberty and justice for all. Lewis was followed across that bridge by ordinary people from all walks of life. We don't even know all their names. The National Voting Rights Museum at the foot of the bridge has collected as many of their stories as possible, which is why we know that many of them, if not most, said they were on that bridge because that's what God wanted them to do. To walk on that bridge is to walk on holy ground. I don't know if I would have had the courage to follow God's call onto the bridge that day, knowing what was on the other side, but I am in awe of those who did. The Voting Rights Museum at the foot of the bridge appears to be a museum without much money, unsupported by government funding, because frankly, it's amateurish. It's mostly on display are pictures, newspaper clippings, and statements relating to the pictures. We saw a lot more sophisticated museums on our trip. But the people at this museum are doing their very best to tell an important story, and it was inspiring to read about the motivations of those on the bridge that day. There aren't many artifacts, and artifacts are what engage me in museums, and I just had a very intense experience on that bridge. So I moved around the museum on autopilot, really not very engaged, when I turned a corner and got the biggest surprise for me of the entire trip, because right there in front of me was an actual jail cell from Selma, Alabama, into which many of the civil rights movement participants had been crammed. Right there in all its dinginess and squalor, though it probably smelled better in the museum than it smelled in real life. In the cell was a big aluminum basin. The marchers, the people in the jail cell asked for water, so Sheriff Jim Clark brought them a great big aluminum tub with a ladle and said to them, "You're dogs, so you can drink like dogs." I was so present in that moment that I never even thought to take a picture of the jail cell, so I don't have one to show you. But it was a vivid demonstration of the ugly racism which these people were fighting and the strength of their faith that enabled them to carry on that fight across that bridge and into that jail cell and wherever it took.
My name is Teresa Edwards. I grew up in a sundowner town. We're on the outskirts. At the city limits, there was a sign that said, "Darky, don't let the sun set on you here." The first black student in our public schools was my senior year in high school. But I wasn't racist. How could I be? There wasn't anybody to be racist against. How could I be even accused of it. There wasn't anybody that even acknowledged that it existed. Well, that stand changed. Through many of Pastor Kathy's book studies, many of her book studies, my truth was uncovered. That led me to the pilgrimage. This photo from the Live Oak Cemetery in Selma symbolizes how I started this trip, not knowing where the road would lead me. It didn't take long for the experience to move from my head to my heart and become a true pilgrimage with my fellow travelers. I also took a friend along via daily text because her father was very active in the civil rights movement. Standing in the driveway of Medgar Evers' home, I texted her this photo. She immediately replied, "Dad used to go to meetings there." I literally gasped. I knew somebody that sat in that living room. I knew him. I started looking at places and people a lot differently. Looking, listening, thinking more sensitively meant some of the sights were startling, even disturbing, like this sculpture in Kelly Ingram Park. The many stone and iron sculptures we saw drew me into the experiences behind the art. This wasn't just history anymore. These were human stories. But they aren't my stories. I can't lay claim to them. None of these events happened to me. While it was important to pay attention to my feelings, I needed to stay focused on listening to others, recognizing that this privileged white woman has a lot to learn and a lot to do. There was a lot to absorb. One of my most impactful lessons came from one man's story in the halls of the Civil Rights Museum. Hezekiah Watkins graciously and vulnerably shared his unsettling story of being imprisoned as a teenager with adults on death row for a few days, simply because he stepped into the white waiting room of a bus station. He still carries the emotional and psychological scars of that experience, and the look in his eyes lingers with me to this day. Remember that photo of the open, solitary road in the Live Oak Cemetery? Well, this light sculpture in the Civil Rights Museum is a reflection of how I felt as our journey ended. Winding, jumbled, beautiful, memorable, and sometimes overwhelming. As I stood looking up through the changing colors at the faces of courageous, faithful foot soldiers in the fight for justice, I felt the weight of their sacrifice, wrapped in the hope that we can do better. I have work to do.
I'm John Wright. I want to share with you just two portraits. One is a portrait of evil. I had no idea of the frequency and savagery of lynchings in America until we visited the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery. There you can look up, you've already seen, but you can look up at rows upon rows of hanging markers commemorating county by county the known almost 5,000 documented lynchings in America, often, as already has been noted, for the slightest provocations. It's as if you're walking under those lynched bodies until you are overwhelmed by the horrendous magnitude of it all. But the account that left me in tears, ashamed of my race, was the lynching of John Hartfield in Ellisville, Mississippi in 1919 for daring to have a white girlfriend. Falsely accused, of course, of raping her by white men in the town. He was arrested and jailed and then turned over by a deputy to the mob. The lynching was so premeditated that the morning newspaper in New Orleans and in Jackson ran the headline, "John Hartfield will be lynched at 5 o'clock this afternoon," as if to advertise the fact. Then adding the note that Governor Bilbo, that is of Mississippi, says he's powerless to prevent it. BS. As many, the ad says 3,000, but accounts say that as many as 10,000 men, women, and children in this small town, 10,000 men, women, and children gathered to watch. After Mr. Hartfield had been hanged, the crowd fired over 2,000 bullets into his body. When one hit the rope and his body fell to the ground, the crowd began to cut off his fingers and toes for souvenirs. They burned his body, all this while taking photographs which were then turned into commemorative postcards that they could send their friends and relatives. When I read this, I was just sick to my stomach. I thought, talk about crimes against humanity. This is as bad as what the Nazis did. Of course, not in scope and mechanical organization, but in terms of the sheer depravity of turning such torture and bodily desecration into community entertainment in the presence of children, so that they would grow up thinking this is the normal way you treat members of the black race. Now, for a portrait of hope. Candace has already alluded to this. As we were about to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, we met Mr. Columbus Mitchell, who told us about his uncle Willie Mitchell, a Korean War veteran who had participated in the march from Selma to Montgomery. And in the melee on Bloody Sunday, Uncle Willie was beaten with a nightstick that left a deep scar on his face. He participated in other demonstrations and was sent to Parchman Prison, off and on, notorious. And he told his nephew that nothing in Korea compared to the experiences that he endured in Parchman Prison, and that if he had to go back there, he would commit suicide. But he remained a disciple of Dr. King's philosophy of nonviolence, and he never gave in to hating white people. The younger Columbus said that his uncle impressed upon him two sayings. Candace has already stolen my thunder on this, but that's all right. They deserve to be repeated. Two sayings. Always remember that anger kills its host, and anyone who can move you to hate has already defeated you. For me, Dr. King's philosophy of nonviolent love has become a turning point in my understanding of how the cross saves me. Not as some kind of sacrifice Jesus had to pay God to get God to forgive us, heaven forbid, but as the supreme demonstration of unconditional, radically inclusive love, which can forgive even those crucifying it, just as Uncle Willie could forgive those who beat him nearly to death. And in the living of that love, that is salvation. That is real life. the abundant life, here and now. I'm so grateful for this experience, and I hope that some of you will consider going on the next pilgrimage.
My name is Judy Burchbill. In reviewing last year's recap of this program, I said that I would go again. Well, I did. In order to revisit the sites that I encountered last year, gave me an opportunity to explore more deeply and to see things that I'd missed before, because there's a lot. I especially enjoyed 2 new sites and an unexpected event. The first new site included the remains of the grocery store in Money, Mississippi, where Emmett Till was falsely accused, the site of the Emmett Till Museum in Glendora, and the site of the Tallahatchie River, where Emmett's body was recovered. And I had to take the video because that place just almost seemed unbelievable. Glendora appears to have had little change since Emmett's death, but they continue to remember the event with the homegrown museum. It was much different in the style from the official museums, but no less powerful in its impact. The unexpected event occurred when we arrived at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. As we arrived, we saw a large group of children and adults following the larger-than-life puppet Amal across America. It was wonderful seeing all of the races celebrating together, so close to the tragedy of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. The Mississippi Civil Rights Museum was another new experience for me. It is formed around a center that has areas for seating and regrouping after encountering the various exhibits. In this space, there are names of those that had had an impact on the civil rights movement, and the song, "This Little Light of Mine," played continuously. Throughout the exhibit, there are posters of individuals that have contributed to this movement in various ways. They are labeled as points of light. This trip left me with a sense of hope. Even though there is still much to be done, I encourage you to make this trip.
I'm going to speak on behalf of Howard. Howard and Mary Jo, of course, live far away and couldn't be here in person. But Howard found the visit to the 16th Street Baptist Church to be most significant. This is the site of the horrific bombings by KKK members, resulting in the death of 4 young girls. Our tour guides provided much of the church's history in the civil rights movement. They related the story of the new stained glass windows at the back of the sanctuary that are of a black crucified Jesus. This window was a gift after the bombing from the people of Wales. The congregation was hesitant to install it at first, stating, "If they bombed us with a white Jesus, what will they do to us? What will they do to us with a black Jesus?" One of the commemorative monuments in Kelly Ingram Park near 6th Street Baptist Church remembers the Children's Crusade and includes an inscription, "I ain't afraid of your jail." This embodies the spirit of courage over fear, which was demonstrated by these young activists. The image that Teresa shared of the dogs, the sculpture, are part of that in Kelly Ingram Park. The children demonstrated great courage by choosing to participate in nonviolent protests in Birmingham, Alabama, risking violence and arrest. In Howard's words, he says, "The pilgrimage is an intense experience." This is outside of 16th Street. I got behind on my slides. And the marker marking the 4 young girls who were killed in the bombing. The pilgrimage is an intense experience. It has caused me to thoughtfully consider the role of First United Methodist Church of Austin and the current struggles faced in our society. I am heartened by the decision taken by pastoral and congregational members to learn more about the challenges of racism and development of actions to address our individual and congregational complicity. Personally, I'd recommend periodic congregational readings of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. This is a call to action and justification of nonviolence as the prominent strategy. Howard Hartman. Like I said when we began, this was a brief opportunity for storytelling. Here, oh wait, no. Where's my end? This version doesn't have it, y'all. I have as our last slide, my goodness. So disappointing sometimes. Let's see if it's in this one. Written in what looks to be a child's handwriting are words that say, so one of my favorite things about the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, as Judy described, was you could move in and out of the displays that were arranged kind of in time spans. And you would go and absorb and learn and experience, and then you could come back to this center space. At the end, they had an opportunity for reflection, and the image I don't have is written in what looks to be a child's handwriting. Words that said at the end, I even typed it. Oh, I can get it right here. The last picture that you can't see, although I also don't need, yeah, good. The question is, where do we go from here? And in what looks to me like a child's handwriting, it says, stay strong and keep walking. Never let anyone turn you around. Keep your head, even when things go bad. God is with you no matter what. And I think that captures where we all find ourselves after a pilgrimage like this. Does anybody have any questions before I close this? Because we have 2 minutes. Yeah. Yes, that's so coming up. So the dates for the 3rd Civil Rights Pilgrimage will be October 13th through 20th. That's the Sunday before, usually if you have Indigenous Peoples Day off, it'll be before that. So Sunday through Sunday. And there will be an interest meeting in April. And so there will be publicity coming out with those dates. And then we'll meet in April to see kind of what kind of interest we have. And I would recommend, Karen.
I just wanted to add,
Speak loud.
because it was an intense experience for all of us. But I think we would also all agree there were moments of wonderful fellowship. And Kathy knows some of the best restaurants in Alabama and Mississippi. And so it's a multifaceted trip. You'll have a good time.
Yes, yeah, this was my 3rd trip, right? My 3rd trip. And each and every time, Judy kind of described it, this was her 2nd time to go on this trip. You see more, you also see a little differently each, and as you learn more and as you draw close. So I do hope, we would love to have another group. If you're interested, but those dates don't work for you, let me know that as well. It would be good to know Back in 2020, we were planning a family trip over spring break, and of course, pandemic. But if there's interest, and we can work on, and there are ways to not, anyway, yeah, just reach out to me. John.
As you might imagine, I had to cut my presentation I have more things to share if you'd like it, and I'm sure several of us would do that. We'd be glad to come to your Sunday school class and share other accounts, other experiences than what we were able to do in this brief moment, wouldn't we?
Yes. Sunday school classes, coffee, small groups, reach out and I can connect y'all, and we would love to share more because there is a lot more to share. Thank you for being here, and thank you all for going on the journey and for sharing today. Thank you, thank you.